further ado, let me introduce to you today's guest speaker, Mr. Kirk Ellis. Kirk has won 2 Emmys, a Writers Guild Award, a Peabody, and Humanitas Prize for his work as writer and co-executive producer of the HBO miniseries John Adams. The miniseries won 13 total Emmys, as well as 4 Golden Globe Awards. Previously, Ellis received an Emmy nomination and won the Writers Guild Award and Humanitas Prize for his ABC miniseries Anne Frank, which he wrote and co-produced. Ellis's latest project, Franklin, debuts globally April 12th on Apple TV+. Michael Douglas stars in the 8-part miniseries, which chronicles Benjamin Franklin's efforts to negotiate a treaty with France at the height of the American Revolution, based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Great Improvisation by Stacy Schiff. Since 2019, Ellis has written and co-written the annual National Memorial Day concert on PBS. He wrote his first book, Ride Lonesome, which is available in a limited supply for you to purchase today, an account of the making of the classic renowned Western series. It was published in March of 2023 by the University of New Mexico Press. He also has a second book that is in the works and will be out in 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, Kirk Ellis.
This isn't generally a problem, but can you all hear me? Great. It's really a pleasure to be back here at the Air Museum. It's been several years since I did one of these lectures, and they're always an educational experience for me because I get to root around the history of my industry, motion pictures and television, find out what was going on, who was doing what, when and where. So this one's called How Hollywood Fought the War on Screen and Off. But we're actually going to talk about, this is really about how Hollywood celebrities actually contributed to the war effort, both in the fight and on the home front. And you plan these things out a year in advance, and you have a very large canvas, but then you realize you've only got about 45 minutes to give the lecture, so you start to consolidate. So if I've missed your favorite people, my apologies in advance. You see Tyrone Power behind me here. That's the last time you're going to see Tyrone Power in this lecture. We're not going to talk about him. So to begin, I want to start, you may find this counterintuitive, but I want to start with this guy. Now, as we all know, unlike his colleagues in motion pictures, John Wayne fought in every theater of war and in every branch of service in World War II, but only on screen. Now, this happens to be a still from a 1949 film called The Sands of Iwo Jima, for which, as a tough-talking sergeant, Wayne was nominated for his first Best Actor Oscar. And it wasn't just audiences who liked Wayne in uniform. One of the big fans of this movie was a gentleman by the name of Douglas MacArthur, who in 1950, in a speech before the American Legion Convention said, and Wayne was there getting an award, and I quote, "You represent the American serviceman better than the American serviceman." Leave it up to Douglas MacArthur for a line like that to endear himself to the guys who fought in the Pacific during World War II. So Wayne got a series of deferments during World War II, largely at the behest of Herbert Yates, who ran the studio Republic because he was Republic's meal ticket during the war. He was a huge star of not only B pictures, but also A pictures. And Yates didn't want to jeopardize that revenue stream. Now, it's controversial how much Wayne went along with this and how much he really protested. We don't really have any records of him going to the draft board, insisting that he be sent abroad. It seemed to be a very comfortable arrangement. But in 1945, while the war is still going on, he's cast in a movie, which I regard, by the way, as the best movie made about World War II during World War II. It's called They Were Expendable. And it's a very dark, tragic story of the PT boat units in the Pacific, and the hammering that they received in those years. And it's John Ford reuniting with Wayne, who he made a star in Stagecoach. And he pairs John Wayne with Robert Montgomery. Now, Robert Montgomery may not be a household name to some people, although looking out the audience, I'm sure many of you remember him. He was very handsome, very talented. He was one of the celebrities who saw the writing on the wall, and in the early 1940s, he volunteered for the American Field Service in Europe, and he was actually an ambulance driver at Dunkirk for that evacuation. The day after Pearl Harbor, Robert Montgomery signed up and became a PT boat commander himself. And he served in Guadalcanal and then again at Normandy during the invasion. John Ford cast John Wayne against Robert Montgomery. Ford was a bastard. He was a great director, but not a nice human being. And he liked a whipping boy. And if the whipping boy could be John Wayne, all the better for him. So he cast Wayne in the film deliberately to humiliate him in front of Robert Montgomery. Whenever he didn't like something Wayne was doing, he would say to Wayne, "Duke, look at what Bob's doing. He was actually in the war." And this went on, and it went on, and it went on for almost the duration of the shoot. And finally, Robert Montgomery said, "Stop it. If you're doing this on my behalf, cut it out or I'm gonna walk off the picture." By all accounts, tough guy John Ford was so stunned, he was actually reduced to tears. I can kind of see him, chewing on his dirty handkerchief that he always carried around. And that was the end of it. So you have this dichotomy between the people who are playing soldiers on screen and those who are fighting. And I want to devote a goodly part of the early part of this lecture to this gentleman, James Stewart. Not James Stewart as it was advertised in the advertising for this lecture, but James Stewart. When he was growing up in Pennsylvania, I always have to get that straight. He grew up in Indiana, Pennsylvania, not Pennsylvania, Indiana. He wanted to be a pilot. He loved the whole idea of flight, and he was from a family that had service dating back to the Civil War. But he got scarlet fever as a kid, and it sidelined those ambitions. But he never gave up this idea of taking to the air. So Stewart comes in, goes to Princeton. He's a very, very smart individual. Goes to Hollywood, and we all know him as this, particularly when you see his films in the 30s, where he is really lanky and clumsy and goofy to an extreme. In 1936, he has a huge series of hits. He does Rose Marie, which is that Jeanette MacDonald Nelson Eddy musical. He does After the Thin Man with William Powell, and another film that are all top of the MGM box office. And what he does with that is he bought a Stinson 105 two-seater, taught himself to fly. He logged 300 hours in it and got his pilot's license while he's still an actor. And he's flying it on the rare days in the studio system that you had any kind of recreational time. James Stewart, as early as 1940, saw the war in Europe as being inevitable. There was nothing that was going to happen that would keep us out of it indefinitely. So in 1939, early 1940, he's finishing up a film called The Philadelphia Story with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn. And he attempts to join the Army Air Corps. This is 1 month before the film comes out. And at that time, the application is not taken seriously, it's not processed. Philadelphia Story comes out in 1940, 1941. James Stewart wins the Oscar. He wins the 1941 Oscar as Best Supporting Actor, or Best Actor, I should say, for that film. He never really liked the Philadelphia Story very much. He didn't like his performance in it. In fact, he voted for the man he thought gave the best performance that year, Henry Fonda, in The Grapes of Wrath. But he wins the Oscar. 23 days later, he goes back to the Army Air Corps, and he takes the oath of service. He takes the oath of service on March 22nd, 1941. There's what's important to remember, is that the cutoff age for that enlistment was 26, and Stewart is 33 at the time, okay? But he has an Ivy League education, and more importantly, he already knows how to fly a plane. So he goes in, and throughout his service, which lasts all the way through the early days of the European campaign past D-Day, Stewart shuns personal appearances. He didn't just play humble, he was humble himself, and he didn't want his service to be seen as a public relations gimmick. He would come back only occasionally for major fundraising drives, otherwise he spent his time in service. Now, for the first 2.5 years of that service, he's stateside at a series of bases, starting in California, but sort of moving up the Pacific coast, training pilots to fly B-17s like the ones you see in the hangar here. But he is itching for a combat position. But when he is on the books in the Army Air Corps, he's booked as a static individual. Static means that he will only see a combat assignment if strings are pulled on the highest possible level to get him there. So one of his last postings is at a place called Gower Field near Boise, Idaho. And toward the end of his stint there, there's a horrible crash in a training exercise in the B-17. And Stewart shows unbelievable grace under pressure in leading the rescue effort to retrieve anybody who may still be alive or seriously wounded from this. And it impresses his commanding officer, who has one of those great World War II names, Colonel Pop Arnold. And so he pulls the strings for James Stewart to become a combat pilot. And here's another one of those age things. This guy's name is Pop Arnold. He's 26 years old, and Stewart is 35 now, doing this, and so you have the younger man, the younger senior officer, pulling the strings for the older man. So he is given command of 15 flight crews flying B-24 Liberators, so that's 10 men each, plus 200 ground crew. That's a total of 350 men under his command. There's only one problem. Stewart's learned to fly B-17 bombers. Now he has to teach himself how to fly a B-24. Now, you've seen the B-17s here. In the hangar, the back hangar, it takes up the entire hangar. The wingspan goes from the door to the concessions counter. 24s were even larger than that. They had longer range and deadlier payloads, but they were more flimsy in terms of their construction. You could shoot it full of holes, and you could shoot a B-17 full of holes pretty readily as well. But the B-24 was an even more dangerous kind of plane to be in charge of. But Stewart commands his first mission on 2 days before Christmas in 1943, and it's a successful raid to destroy the U-boat yards in Kiel, Germany. From that, over the course of his service in World War II, James Stewart flies 20 missions, okay, losing very, very few of his crew, and he's often the pilot on these missions. He ultimately gets a promotion to lieutenant colonel, and on D-Day is given the assignment to coordinate. Now, he's lieutenant colonel, which means he's now flying a desk. And he's in charge of his crews who are doing the flying over the English Channel. And he's meant to coordinate the air cover for Omaha Beach and for those landings. Unfortunately, the low cloud cover that day caused his bombers to miss their mark, which led to significant complications for the people making that landing that day. But Stewart goes on and will appear as officers in films about Normandy and the European campaign later on in the 50s and 60s. Now, I want to come back to James Stewart. at the end of this lecture. Years ago, and many of you may have been here, I did a lecture about the directors, John Ford, Frank Capra, John Huston, George Stevens, William Wyler, who went to war for our propaganda arm. And it changed them for life as filmmakers and artists. It had that same effect on many of the actors who went. But I want to conclude with that. So, after James Stewart is, here you have truly storybook couple of Hollywood, Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. When this picture was taken, it was right before Pearl Harbor. They'd been married about 2 years. It was Gable's third marriage and her second. They had gotten married. They eloped during the break from filming when Gable was doing Gone with the Wind. They went to Kingman, Arizona without telling anybody, and came back and began work on it. There's a house up on Chino, kind of next to, and Chino and Palm Canyon here, next to the complex where you have coffee and just fabulous, called the Casa de Corazon, which is allegedly their honeymoon house. It isn't, but it's a great legend for the real estate people renting it and selling it. So like James Stewart, they were early and enthusiastic supporters of America's entry into World War II. In that brief period between December 7th and the end of the year, they hosted significant and heavy-duty fundraisers, both at MGM and at their home. They both were accomplished equestrians. They gave equestrian exhibitions, and they donated all the proceeds to causes like the Red Cross and to the American military. So at the end of 41, Lombard on Christmas Eve. This is how hard Hollywood worked back in those days. If you think the hours now are tough, they worked on Christmas Eve, and on midnight on Christmas Eve, Carole Lombard wrapped principal photography on a wonderful film that was released about a year and a half later called To Be or Not to Be, with Jack Benny, one of the great early black comedies. She immediately went on to a war bond tour, and her goal was to get her husband in uniform. And Gable wanted to serve, but he was 40 years old. So if you thought James Stewart was a senior citizen, at the recruitment office, this guy walks in, wait a sec. But they were determined to find some way to get Clark Gable overseas. So she tours from Hollywood. It's meant to go all the way to New York. And somewhere along the way, she sent him a telegram that said, hey, Pappy, it's time to get you in uniform, and I mean real service, not one of those phony commissions that many other actors and people like Colonel Jack Warner were getting as a kind of milksop from the military. So the Treasury Department had given Lombard a fundraising goal of $500,000. In Indianapolis, she raised $2 million in one appearance. And she felt, job done. I gotta get back. Clark's got this other picture he has to finish before we can get him in a uniform, and he's starring with Lana Turner, and I just don't trust either one of them. So the rest of the bond tour went on in New York. She went back to California. Now, these actors were under strict instructions to only take the train back. But she wanted to get back to the West Coast as soon as possible. So she booked a TWA flight. It was a TWA Flight 3. It was a Douglas DC-3 propeller plane that had refueling stops in St. Louis, Albuquerque, and Las Vegas. That's back in the day before it was transcontinental. That's what you did. So in Las Vegas, there are 19 people on the plane. 15 of them are booted off the flight because they have to get Army Air Corps service personnel on the flight. Carole Lombard stays on the plane. 15 minutes after taking off, the plane, as a result of pilot error, crashes inside of the mountain. Everybody's killed. There are very, very few remains. Gable isn't even allowed to visit the site. But This photo will tell you a lot. That's Carol Onward. You can see how incandescent she was as an actress. By the way, at the time of her death, she was 32 years old. That's Clark Gable. Everybody who knew Gable at this time said that her death changed him forever. He was known to hold court at the MGM commissary. He would sit by himself. He took to drinking a quart of scotch a day, a regimen he kept up until his early death from a heart attack shortly after filming The Misfits with Marilyn Monroe in 1959. But he was determined to go into service. Now, there's a lot of stuff out there about Gable joining up and becoming a gunner on B-17s because he had a death wish. That doesn't seem to be borne out by anything that we know. He did write that he said to friends, I'm going in and I don't expect to come back and I don't really give a hoot. But in that sense, I'm not sure he was any different from anybody else who was signing up to go over there who knew what the dangers were. So MGM was going to try to ease his way into this. It's like, look, Clark, maybe you don't want to do that. How about we'll give you a film crew, you'll do a documentary. And it turned out, this, the vets here won't be surprised by this, the Air Corps had a problem recruiting gunners for the B-17s because they had a tendency not to come back from these missions. So ostensibly, Gable was going to be making a documentary about gunners. There would be a recruitment tool. But he didn't want any favors. He insisted on enlisting in the officers' school. So he graduated 700th in his class. 700th out of 2,600 people. So he was in the first third of that graduating class. And he was assigned to the 351st Bomb Group out of England. And they were all B-17 flying fortresses like the ones you see in Memphis Belle. Now, Gable did shoot film. As part of this, he shot 50,000 feet of it, enough to make Killers of the Flower Moon 10 times, right? And the film is available on YouTube, but unlike Memphis Belle, William Wyler's film, it never got much distribution. And Gable didn't care because what mattered to him was he was up there fighting. So his first mission was on May 4th, 1943, over Antwerp. And it was a successful mission to destroy the Ford and General Motors plants that were there that the Axis powers and the Nazis had co-opted. And they bombed the hell out of that. And he was in the plane, shooting footage, when the side machine gunner on the 50 cal was shot and killed. And Gable, who was trained in the use of these machine guns, picked up the machine gun and carried on the fight. And he maintained that position on various B-17s throughout the course of the war. And I love this story. This was on the fourth mission. The plane he was on was called Ain't It Gruesome? And it was his first and only raid over Germany. And over the course of that flight, a 20-millimeter shell ripped through the fuselage of the plane, took off his boot heel, exited the cabin over his head, and he and most of the other people on the plane didn't know about it for the simple reason that their plane dropped 11,000 feet as a result of the impact. And they were all struggling to breathe and to just stay alive. So that was sort of his trial by fire. And his ability, again, he's 40, he ages up to 42, 43 during the course of the war, won him the respect of every flight crew he was with. And he had this gag he would do back in England. Clark Gable had false teeth, upper end. And he would take his teeth out at the commissary and he'd band his gums together and go, I'm king of Hollywood. Put the teeth back in. So, to a certain degree, rather than this being a death wish for Clark Gable, it turned out to be slightly restorative, both for his sense of self and some way to grieve this loss, to know that the love of his life had not died in vain, that there was some payoff to all of that. Now, there's a side story, just briefly, I wonder if anybody here recognizes this actor. Thank you. That's Leslie Howard, who was Clark Gable's co-star, Ashley Wilkes in Gone with the Wind. Very handsome, very debonair, very intellectual English actor who had basically made his career in Hollywood from the late 1920s, in late silent films, all the way through the 1930s. And he was poised for major American stardom in 1939. And then, of course, September 39 comes around and England's at war. Howard abandons his Hollywood career, goes back to his home country, stars in a series of propaganda films. Most of them terrible, but some of them, like 49th Parallel, directed by Michael Powell, really, really good wartime dramas. And he becomes Britain's national ambassador for the cause. And just as we had a goodwill tour here in the States, people would go down to Mexico and Latin America to say, please stay neutral. We don't care if you join us, just don't join Hitler. Howard was sent on a similar mission to Spain and Portugal in May 1943. And it was very successful. He had a private meeting with Franco, allegedly at the behest of Winston Churchill. We don't know for sure. And on June 1st, is that right? Yeah, June 1st, he's crossing back to London from Lisbon on a commercial flight. And this flight had been attacked previously. So the plane was camouflaged, painted in camouflage. And somewhere in its early trajectory, it was attacked by a fleet of junkers and shot down with the loss of all the passengers. And Leslie Howard was one of them. And there were circumstances about whether or not he was targeted. It was known that he was doing this mission to Spain and Portugal, Franco especially, and that Churchill had some knowledge of it. What makes the story even more sinister is the fact that the British, we know now from the late 1950s from the then head of British intelligence, that the British knew the plane was targeted and would very likely be shot down. And they couldn't say a word about it. Why? It would betray their knowledge of the Enigma code, which they had just cracked. So even with one of their star performers and star patriots aboard, the plane was shot down. These circumstances are still being debated. I mean, you can go down a conspiracy rabbit hole really easily with the Leslie Howard story, but I'll move on to the home front. Because there were people who couldn't serve. Women, for instance. And so I have three issues. This is the Hollywood Canteen. Okay? So let's talk about the origin of the Hollywood Canteen for a second. This is the brainchild of an actor named John Garfield, whose name I'm sure will be familiar to all of you. Garfield could not serve because he was 4F because of a heart condition that killed him in 1950, not long after the end of the war. But he was inspired by the Stage Door Canteen on 42nd Street, which was also catering to servicemen on sort of their last gasp of domestic life and tranquility and just having a good time before they went overseas. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. So he enlisted the help, and I'll actually jump 2 slides. He enlisted the help of Betty Davis. Now, this is Oscar weekend, so it's worth a slight digression. At the time Garfield talks to her, Betty Davis is the just resigned president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. She'd served exactly 3 months in the job, and she had left in protest over how the 1942 Academy Awards would look. As you may recall, if you've seen the newsreel footage, it was a very staid affair. Black tie, very ritzy, very elite, almost like a country club dinner. And Davis said to her co-governors, "That's wrong. This is wartime. We've got to do something that reflects America today. Let's open it up. Let's rent an auditorium. Let's make it more casual. Let's invite the public. Let's charge a minimal amount of money for a ticket, and let's donate the money to the Red Cross." No. It's our tradition to do such and such and such and such. So she walked out. And I can just imagine John Garfield picking up the phone and going, "Hey, Bat, I got an idea for you, but I've got a building for you as well." And he did. He had this piece of property at 1451 Cahuenga. And when Betty Davis saw it, in classic Margaret Channing fashion, she said it was one step below an eyesore. That nobody was going to come to that. She called in a bunch of favors with studio technicians, set designers, fabric designers, and all of that, and had the place decorated really, really well. And it opened on October 3rd, 1942, and it looked like this. Now, there were some rules at the Hollywood Canteen that I need to go over here for people just to correct some misimpressions. It was a dry canteen. You could get coffee, you could get soda, sandwiches, and maybe a dinner that would be cooked in the kitchen for you by Spencer Tracy or Henry Fonda or somebody. But you couldn't get any booze. Any fraternization with both celebrity and civilian hostesses was strictly a no-no. All the actresses were given cards to put in their apron pockets that had the address of the studio on them. So that when it was serviceman said, "Hey, can I write you, Betty, or Veronica?" It's like, "Yes," and here's the card. It was, of course, a General Post Office box, that 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, MGM, whatever. But remarkably, it was integrated. You were as likely to dance at the Hollywood Canteen with Marcia Hunt, who danced with thousands and thousands of servicemen, both during and after the war at the canteen. You could dance with Anna Mae Wong while Lena Horne was singing Stormy Weather from the stage. And there were very few complaints. There was one though. John Ford's wife, Mary, who was a very conservative Catholic, volunteered almost every day at the Hollywood Canteen. She was not happy with what she called mixed race dancing. And she would call the LAPD from time to time and get officers to come out and break it up. But of course, there was no law against it. There's nothing the LAPD could do. They got so tired of her complaints, they found John Ford, they telegrammed him at Claridge's Hotel in London, where he was about to go over to help shoot the Normandy landings for the OSS. And Ford got back to them by cable, and what he said is instructive, partly about the state of his marriage at that point. He wired back, he said, quote, "My wife is inclined to become agitated and excited about racial matters, and you are hereby authorized to take Mrs. Ford out of the canteen should she ever become obnoxious." So that's how that problem was solved. So you wouldn't just see Betty Davis. You would see Rita Hayworth at Hat Check. You would see Dietrich, Marlene Dietrich or Hedy Lamarr serving you at a table, possibly serving you drinks. Sinatra would sing there all the time. It was a wonderful place for these guys to be, because all those partying servicemen you saw in the second photo, they're all going to Guadalcanal, they're going to Saipan, they're going to Peleliu, they're going to Iwo Jima, they're going to places few of them came back from. So this was how people who were not allowed to wear uniform served. But there was one other way. So you know this guy over here behind me, okay? Bob Hope in USO Tour. This is where he first worked on those jokes that he told for like the next 50 years. They always seem to work. But his wasn't the only tour. There was another. It was called Four Jills in a Jeep. That traveled far more than Hope did with the USO. And it was led by this woman. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Kate Francis, who at the time was not only the highest paid female star in Hollywood, she was the highest paid woman in America. She was Warner Brothers' #1 box office star, soon to be replaced by Betty Davis, toward the end of the 1930s. She was known as a fashion play. Her movies for Warner Brothers had, I think it was in her contract that there had to be a minimum of 10 costume changes over an hour-long film. Here's an example of the kinds of things she wore. That's from a 1934 film called Mandalay, where she's actually playing a prostitute. Obviously one who's being paid very well. So, Kay starts this troupe of women performers. And this is a World War II image of the women. These are the four Jills. So, going from left to right, you've got Carol Landis, who you probably don't remember. She was in a movie called 1 Million BC, not the Raquel Welch film, The Good One from 1940. It was a pinhead. So you've got her there. That's Martha Ray driving the Jeep. You've got Mitzi Mayfair there over Martha's shoulder, and that's Kay, the fashion plate, in the back, waving. So from October 30th, 1942, until late January 1943, these women traveled 37,500 miles across Europe, Algiers, North Africa, and the South Pacific. Kay Francis, for this entire trip, she was a wonderful diarist. We know what she was doing from her earliest days. She made her debut in a Marx Brothers film called The Coconuts in 1929, and worked until the late 1950s, and kept a diary. We know who her sex partners were, what she thought of them. She had a numerical ranking. Maurice Chevalier was here. Otto Preminger was somewhere in the middle. So there was all of this. But so she abandons all of this. She takes along 7 outfits and 1 evening dress for this entire trip. By her own account, the women bathed about once a week, if they were lucky. They played theaters, hospitals, improvised stages, and once even played in a boxing ring. I imagine that was probably somewhere in England, but we have a record of exactly where it was. For all of these overseas crossings, they rode in B-17s. And it says something for their level of exhaustion that in one crossing of the English Channel, they came under attack and Kay Francis slept through it. That exhausted for this. They had a great rap, which we have a record of, and I want to read you. Kay was the MC for this, and this is how she would open the shows. Perhaps you'd like to know a little about our trip over here. The Army flew us in a bomber from California to New York, or she would change that, She would change that depending on where they were coming to and from. Yeah, it was a nice little bomber, a sweet little bomber, with the cutest little 10-inch guns. And the pilot, boy, he was the best looking fellow I'd ever seen. I didn't know you could fly a bomber with one hand, but you can. When we got here, they wanted to do this, we wanted to do that. So then, we were pretty hungry when we arrived. So Martha Ray stepped up to the colonel and said, "Sir, where do we eat?" The colonel said, "You mess with the man." And Martha said, "Yeah, I know that, but where do we eat?" So this is how the show would go. From place to place and from base to base and all that. And they never really got tired of it. And there were no chance for them to go home. But the tour ended with a command performance at Windsor Castle. So I can only imagine this is where Kay finally got to put on that evening gown, looking as glamorous as she did in those pre-code Warner Brothers films. And according to her diary, and this is a scene that I wish Peter Morgan had put in The Crown, she taught Princess Margaret to jitterbug. And then they went home. Now, a book came out shortly after their return, allegedly written by Carol Landis, probably ghostwritten, by somebody else, commemorating and fictionalizing this tour, called for Jills in a Jeep. And it was, of course, bought for a film. 20th Century Fox bought the film, made it into a movie. So here's the actual World War II still, okay? This is the recreation of the still for the film. Now, I call this still Four Jills and a Jerk. Okay? The jerk being Phil Silvers, who was thrown into the mix because even in wartime, you can't have a movie with all women. Nobody's gonna watch it. So they brought in up-and-coming Phil Silvers to do all the jokes for this. And it was heavily glamorized. And lucky for you, I've got a clip to show you. And I don't know how the volume will play here, but you will see that it is anything but gritty. Let's see what I have to do here.
It's from that plane that you gave me photograph to. Miss Benson, this is from that English captain you met on the plane. Do you remember?
Eddie, just deliver it, don't read it. K, Mitzi, Martha, K, Mitzi, K, me, Jen.
Oh, Miss Ray, what can I do to make you happy?
Janet's 24-hour leave and he's going to meet me for a week of Sunday. Now listen, Caroline, you know I can't tell you. Although I know it's a military secret, but this is Jen's only chance. Come on, break down. Well, we've just been asked the Lady Collins Minister for the weekend. Where? We do a Red Cross benefit there. We'll have time to rehearse a new show, get all polished up. Where is it? Buy some new dresses, need a lot of brass hats and baskets, and stay in bed and rest. Where?
So, I write historical drama for a living, and I was shocked to discover that never happened on this trip. But it did remind me of something. Among the things that we all, those of us who love Kate Francis, love about her is this slight speech impediment she had, where she couldn't say R's right. She was often known in the gossip columns as the ravishing Kate Francis. And shortly after this comes about, and Warner Brothers wants to get rid of her, I kid you not, Jack Warner started to instruct his screenwriters to include as many words with the letter R into her dialogue as possible. And she was a trooper. She waded through. She was getting paid $5,250 a week before the war and during the war. And she wasn't about to let that contract go. And good to the end, when Kate Francis died, she gave all of her money to her pets and the American Humane Society. So, we talked about Stewart, and I said I wanted to go back to him and how people were changed. James Stewart came back from the war having seen probably more than any of his colleagues in the motion picture industry. And he knew what war was like. He knew what death was like. And his films changed, and his performances changed. We all look at It's a Wonderful Life at Christmas. That's not a happy film, folks. It's about a guy who's about to commit suicide as the film starts. And even as the angel shows him that his life is worth living, he still remains angry, morose, disconnected from his family. Stewart's performance in that film is haunting. But it gets a lot more intense than that. In the early 1950s, James Stewart became the first actor to do independent production. He had this weird idea that his agent, Lou Wasserman, sold to Universal, which didn't believe it could happen, that Jimmy's not going to take a salary. He's going to take a percentage of the picture, the gross percentage. So as soon as people come into the theater, he's going to get a piece of that ticket. They're like, Never going to happen. Sure, he done my salary? Fine. Of course, it made him a millionaire. And he created the system that we now live with. But he did a series of westerns with Anthony Mann. And the first one was Winchester 73. And I want you to look at James Stewart in this still. That's Dan Duryea getting his head slammed against the bar repeatedly. Here's how Stewart looks in the close-up. He couldn't have played that part had he not gone to Europe in World War II, had he not flown those bombers, had he not served his country. He saw the darkness that the war brought out, and it really never left him. And so when we think of Hollywood, and we think of people getting a free ride, people not serving their country, people not being patriotic, I think that the thing I want to leave you with is that people serve their country in every possible way. Yes, even John Wayne, making these films that ginned up the services and got people to enlist and to root for the American military. But there were those who served. There were those who served, there were those who put their lives on the line and went back to do really great work and stayed patriots throughout their lives. And James Stewart was, I think, first and foremost among them. And with that, I thank you all for your attention, your interest, and we have time for questions.